Hi, I'm Kim Munro from RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. This presentation is called Live Documentary Performance, Ephemeral Forms for Precarious Times, which this really speaks to the moment that we're in. Primarily, this is a survey of live documentary performance and how the pandemic has facilitated these forms to virtual space over the past year. So first, I'll give a bit of a brief background on what I mean by live documentary performance. I'll then situate in the current field, discuss some of the works from the past year, and also talk a little bit about how virtual might open up live documentary performance in filmmaking to previously unimagined possibilities. So looking back at the past, at the history of documentary, writes William Orecchio, we've been able to see the future innovations in documentary as a continuity of long-term cultural fascination, which can help us anticipate patterns of popular reception. So really looking back in this rearview mirror, we're able to speculate on the future and also really sort of identify what are new innovations in the form and what is a continuation. Cinema has been traditionally a collective experience, and early non-fiction encounters trace back to the rumoured audience participation of the Lumiere brothers' actualities in the late 19th century. Of course, we all know about the train arriving at the station and the rumoured reactions to that from the audience. So around the same time, silent films would be seen accompanied by live music, often consisting of a piano or organ, at times a small orchestra. Before becoming primary modes of entertainment, early film experiences were an integral part of the public sphere, which might relate to health, education, magic, and science. A lecturer or a stage performer would often accompany early films who would localize the content, mediate the experience, and comment on the crowd's behavior. The emergence of fiction form soon overshadowed early years of non-fiction film, and the lecture was removed in favor of the standardization of the film. As fictional narratives became popular through the early 20th century, audiences continued to encounter the represented world through newsreels, which would deliver sober educational realities to the masses. And despite documentary's ongoing play with form and inventiveness, the schism between non-fiction's association with the serious and the sober and the fiction film with entertainment has plagued documentary ever since. More recent examples can be seen here in Florian Thalhofer's live interactive documentaries that use the algorithm-based interactive Korsakov software. Korsakov shows were both interactive and participatory, giving the audience multiple ways to engage in the process and the subject matter. In conducting these performative shows, Thalhofer would enlist the help of two experts on the topic. The experts would stand on a stage in front of the screen playing multiple simultaneous video clips, replicating the associative connections in the Korsakov film. The audience, equipped with laser pointers, would select which clip they wanted to appear next. Here, the laser pointer acted in much the same way as clicking a mouse at a computer, only in a public and performative space. When inspired by the material, the experts could push a button and a light would appear, indicating their interest in speaking. The audience could also share their thoughts via anonymous text or Twitter, or elect to speak themselves. But unlike the early examples of the lecture film, the Korsakov shows didn't rely on a host to give the audience a summary or interpretation of the narrative. Instead, it was left up to the audience to create their own meaning and their own interpretation from the fragments of the show. Canadian filmmaker Kim Nelson has developed her approach to the form, which she calls either live participatory documentary or live interactive documentary. And this implicates the audience in the work by making them an active participant as well. So these events have two parts. The first one is a deconstructed documentary, which has project clips, interviews alongside a live narration. In the second part, the audience comments on and speaks, comments on and ask questions of the filmmaker, editor, and composer, who then respond with more experimental or archival material and interviews. And this creates a dialogical interaction. A live construction of meaning around the themes and subject matter follow. For Nelson, this provides an opportunity for multiple interpretations and allows for meaning to be co-created and contested. These performances coalesce Nelson's quest of co-creating a space where meaning and truth can be debated and constructed. It also reinvigorates this sense of a public, which has receded into the private and taken up by streaming culture, says Nelson. So these two examples really epitomize this documentary as an open text and how the audience might become an integral part of creating the work, completing the work, and creating and contesting meaning around truth and the documentary material. Examples of live documentary as well as scholarly work are relatively scarce. In Judith Aston's chapter from this book, this iDocs book, her chapter is called Interactive Documentary and Live Performance from Embodied to Emplaced Interaction. Aston sketches out some thoughts on the intersection between theatre, performance, and interactive documentary. Aston suggests that this loosely categorized and under-theorized form is an antidote to the sterility of having everything always on tap in a world swamped by screens and pre-recorded media, which, sort of ironic now that we're like, over the last year, we've really sort of, this immersion and engulfment in screens has really come to the fore. However, I want to take Aston's ideas further and situate them into the context of 2020, 2021, and the ubiquity of screen spaces or the virtual. From Middle English, virtual was to possess many virtues. But I also borrow here from new media scholar Francis Dyson, who describes the virtual space as, quote, immaterial, as well as, quote, an ontological state or condition wherein existence can take place and where users can be. Whether virtual, physical, across time zones and hemispheres, or in an embodied space through performative practices, live documentary can respond to the moment with a kind of liveness traditionally attributed to theatre or performed music. So how do you adapt or create something live when being in the space at the same time is such a big part of the work? In 2020, as festivals began to be cancelled and move online, one of the challenges was to reformat these performances. So in the first example, Joe Beanie and Maya Hawke's Little Ethiopia She Nu, which is both a performance of filmmaking and also of their relationship. And that plays with this notion explicitly and metaphorically. The multi-layered documentary had been performed 7 or 8 times in theatres and cinemas in the US and Europe, and was to be part of IDFA's Doc Lab exhibition called Do Not Touch in October 2020. As the pandemic intensified across Europe and the world, Beanie and Hawkes had to reformat their live performance to a virtual space. Little Ethiopia She Nu takes its name from the area of Los Angeles where the couple used to live before relocating to London. Throughout the work, editors Beanie and Hawke tell stories of their relationship in crisis using films they have made for each other and the performance. These short pieces are assembled from home videos, photographs, and excerpts from the films they have each cut, including films by Lynn Ramsey, Werner Herzog, and Vincent Gallo. Although Little Ethiopia had been performed several times, the IDFA iteration had a mix of pre-existing elements as well as new components explicitly produced for the here and the now, or the present tense. Moving between Instagram feeds, a digital library, and footage of exteriors and interiors, the performance begins in the domestic space, with Beanie in their London flat explaining the evolution of the project. Speaking directly to the audience, Beanie reveals the tension underlying the project and the conflict about how to start this performance. Hawke then beguiles with the story of a dead girl under a tree, which may or may not be true. The performance is a two-hander, and Beanie responds with a desktop-style presentation of memories of the drive between LA and San Francisco along Interstate 5. Beanie speaks metaphorically of this stretch of road as less a place than a long transition, a state of being between actual states of being, the midpoint of a long cross dissolve between flashback and something that hasn't happened yet and may never. Drawing on the vast array of material available, which includes the vernacular, data, images, text, and social media, and the cinematic, the production values become less important on a screen. This desktop aesthetic embodies what Greg DeCure calls, quote, lingua franca, that all people can speak and engage with, end quote. The aesthetic of the familiar interfaces of editing software, QuickTime, MacBook, desktop, Getty image, watermarks further collapses the distinction between our screens and their screens, our lives and their lives. There's something uncannily prescient in little Ethiopia, or at least related to the time of COVID. This is the stuff of dreams and memories, a strange disconnection between what happened this year and what might have been imagined. If it happened on the screen, is it real? As much of the world battled with deaths and hospitalizations, protests, denials, misinformation, and vast responses to the pandemic, it was as though we were living in a sliding doors moment. The project and layers that Beanie and Hawk have created are richly woven with a meditation on time and perspective. The link is uploaded to Vimeo, but it is not static. In a conversation on Zoom from our respective homes in Melbourne and London, Maya Hawk tells me of the feedback that she received on the film, and that she's added more sequences that elevate her voice, thereby demonstrating the openness of the text and perhaps the unfinished film. There's no definitive story. It's the one that's created. Similarly, Little Ethiopia embraces the participatory conversations afforded through the medium to create an open-ended discursive text that embraces the aesthetic of the multiple small screens. Moving on to the next work. Bringing the computer screen to an embodied audience enables truly independent or non-traditional documentary to find an audience. Creating an opportunity for the documentary project to facilitate conversations can often require broader strategies beyond the film festival, cinema screening, or online distribution. Lance Wheeler's Where There's Smoke was originally a sophisticated transmedia experience that was conceived of as a way for Wheeler to spend time with his father, who was dying of cancer. Robert Wheeler, his father, was a volunteer firefighter and amateur fire photographer. And much of Lance's childhood was spent chasing fires with his fire-obsessed dad. The project was originally performed as part of a live documentary, part immersive theatre and part escape room at Tribeca Film Festival in 2019 as part of the Virtual Arcades program. Reconfigured as an online storytelling performance for 2020, Wheeler held 2 back-to-back events of Where There's Smoke. In the one that I attended, there are around 27 participants. The opening part of Where There's Smoke invites the audience into a waiting room that uses Miro's online collaborative whiteboard tool. The canvas contains post-it notes, images, text, and video and audio clips. The time spent here, it's like a waiting room. So we enter into this space and it feels a little bit less abrupt than launching straight into the Zoom. Rather, the audience can stroll around and scroll around the space and introduce ourselves and where we're joining from and learn the functions of Miro before the show begins. Structured over 5 chapters, Where There's Smoke alternates between pre-prepared video sequences, participatory interactions with other people, and also a self-guided opportunity to explore questions around fires, loss, and grief. The multiple aspects of nonlinear meandering around this space replicate how memory works and stories are remembered. It also evokes the nature of grief, how it envelops, doubles down and dissipates in cycles, mixing modes of telling and allowing the audience to find meaning for themselves. Here, Wheeler just demonstrates the art of finding the form which will best tell the story, while also retaining aspects of the original embodied experience. So he's really shifted, using the Zoom, but also shifting into other platforms that allow for this really non-linear experience that was part of the original work. The final piece I want to talk about, I'm really interested in this one because this is one of probably the latest one I saw, and it's really, using the form and really sort of building a project based on using Zoom and using live streaming. So this was held in April as part of CPH Docs in Copenhagen. It's called Those Left Waiting, which is a live documentary filmed and watched in real time. So each of the 3 performances was held over a different time of the day or night and encompassed the locations of Kenya, Indonesia, Mexico, Jordan, Uganda, and Greece. In this project, long-term refugees with an interest in filmmaking or creative practices were identified in the refugee camps in these locations and trained how to use their mobile phone, or I guess it was a mobile phone, to capture scenes from their lives. At any given time, the filmmakers start recording what they encountered. The live streams are edited as they're filmed, with intertitles being sort of inserted, and a live score also performed at the same time. So what we're watching is a live film being made across multiple locations in different refugee camps around the world. So while this work shifts away from the performative, or the audience constructing meaning through the openness of the text, there's really something about the immediacy of knowing that what we're watching is happening exactly as the refugees are seeing it at this time. After the event, there's a Q&A with the filmmakers and participants who then had the chance to bring the experiences closer to us. So in some ways, the filmmaking was a vehicle for us to hear their firsthand accounts, as we're all equalized in these small boxes on the Zoom interface. So in conclusion, this presentation has discussed a range of live virtual documentary performances that use the interactivity of online platforms and participatory strategies in order to implicate the audience in the documentary meaning making. In their experiments, the projects grapple with the isolating tendencies of the pandemic, geographical space, and questions of truth. These documentaries occupy a liminal space between the material and virtual, audience and participant, and domestic and public. This presentation has intended to take an in-depth look at documentary's continual ability to reinvent and adapt, not only with subject matter and technology, but also with global crises. I present these works not in their reduced form, but rather as an emerging field that foregrounds invention and resistance and reasserts documentary as a collective experience through which meaning and knowledge can be co-created, and where the role of the audience is integral to the work. Despite the irreplaceable experience of being together in a shared space, live documentary performance can also outlive the temporality of the pandemic and present possibilities for more sustainable and accessible and invigorated practices in the future. Thank you very much for listening.